What is there to even say about The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, that hasn't already been said 1,000 times by thousands of different people over the course of the past 23 years? And yet, despite the vast amount of voices that have echoed every last detail about this game, I feel compelled to add my own feelings as well. This series represents so many different things to so many different people that I believe that there are never truly enough opinions out there. Ocarina of Time stands front and center in most people's minds as one of the most iconic and well-beloved video games of all time, and for good reason. So sit back, get comfortable, and let me share why The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time is a masterpiece. It goes without saying that Ocarina of Time is probably one of the most recognizable video games in history. And that goes well beyond just the title. From the music, to the characters, and even the iconic designs of the Hylian shield and Master Sword. This is a game that has solidified itself in the history books and in the minds of millions. But why is that? What is it about this world and story that captivates so many people? Is it truly just nostalgia that plays a role in why people have such a deep, profound view of this game? Or does it go beyond that? And while it's true that this game can be very nostalgic, I believe that does such a great disservice to the vibrant and diverse world that Nintendo created all those years ago. The entire DNA of what is considered the iconic 3D Zelda formula all originated from this game. The transition into 3D so shortly after having nailed the series' identity with A Link to the Past could have easily been an undertaking that ended in disaster. How do you take the top-down combat and dungeon design from the series' other games and adapt that into a 3D space? And yet, Nintendo was able to pull it off in style. Ocarina of Time's world is filled to the brim with diverse locations, characters, and challenges that all blend together with its cinematic structure. In a way, from a design perspective, Ocarina was a culmination of everything the series had brought out over the span of the 2D games. The open exploration in the overworld, the use of items to progress to new areas, the contrasting locations to visit over the course of the adventure. Ocarina nailed the transition from 2D to 3D, and in my opinion, surpassed everything that had come before it. From the childlike comfort of Kokiri Forest to the hellish nightmares and isolation of the Shadow Temple, Ocarina proves that it is a master of setting tone and atmosphere, clashing together vastly different locations and characters, yet never breaking immersion that this is one large, interconnected world. It's this believability that makes Ocarina of Time truly shine and stand out. Every major character, new location, new item, new ability, all paced perfectly over the course of the adventure, and it's in this pacing and masterful simplicity where I find Ocarina of Time truly holds the crown. The consistency of its narrative, game design, and presentation is hard to match, even up against some of the games that followed it. From the moment the player is given control over Link, we're introduced to the starting area of the game, Kokiri Forest. Tasked with meeting the Great Deku Tree, the player is eventually stopped by Mido, who states that he refuses to let Link pass until he first presents a sword and shield. The sword, of course, being hidden in a maze-like area, and the shield being sold at Kokiri's shop for 40 rupees. What may at first seem like a tedious diversion on the way to meet the Deku Tree is actually the first taste of the subtle but effective way in which the Zelda team forces the player to explore and get used to the layout without them even realizing it. With the basic task of collect 40 rupees, the player has no choice but to experiment with what is and isn't possible in the new world. Entering buildings, talking to NPCs, cutting grass, and even being rewarded for climbing on top of structures. This subtle yet simple task acts as a tutorial for what the player can expect to be doing throughout the entire game. And odds are, they don't even realize it in the moment. This consistency in game design extends into each of Ocarina of Time's many dungeons as well. Looking at just the child dungeons, while the Great Deku Tree, Dodongo's Cavern, and Jabu Jabu's Belly may not seem like much in comparison to the full-fledged temples of the Adult Link section, viewing all three of them as a whole shows just how well crafted they are for what they're trying to accomplish. They each act as a sort of slow burn for the player, drip-feeding new ideas and concepts, slow enough to not overwhelm the player, yet at a steady enough rate to make sure that tedium or boredom never sets in. Despite the fact that the three child dungeons gradually increase in difficulty, none of them ever come close to the complexity of the temples found later in the adult era. The visual contrast between the living and organic areas of the first 3 dungeons versus the more man-made and sometimes industrial feel of the temples further proved just how good Miyamoto and the rest of the team incorporated visuals and theming into the overall gameplay progression. Take for example, Dodongo's Cavern versus the Fire Temple. As Child Link, the overall vibe of Dodongo's Cavern is that of a mostly natural forming cave. Lava pools, tunnels, and rock formations that blend seamlessly within the environment. As a result of this, progression to the temple feels simplistic. Go to one side, hit a switch, go to the other side, open the central door where the boss resides. Everything feels straightforward and natural. Now let's take a look at the Fire Temple. From the very moment we enter, we're greeted with a staircase and 3 tiki torch-looking figures at the top, with doors going to the left and right. A once safe place of worship turned into a prison of death for the Goron locked away in there. Imagery of iron bars, stone rooms, and overall man-made architecture are spread throughout the Fire Temple, reminding the player that this is a place that was built, a structure crafted by man, or in this game's case, the Goron people. The oppressive nature of this dungeon is accompanied by the much more intricate and difficult challenges that the player must overcome. The adult atmosphere directly corresponding to the more mature and difficult trials that this dungeon presents. So, despite the fact that both Dodongo's Cavern and the Fire Temple are located within Death Mountain, the game makes sure that nothing ever feels stale due to the vastly different representations and how these dungeons are handled from a difficulty perspective as well as a visual design perspective. The reason behind Ocarina's consistent feel lies in how seamlessly this difficulty progression is incorporated into the visual theming of the rest of the game. And while the jump in difficulty from the Great Deku Tree to something like the Shadow Temple is pretty large when compared side by side, the game is paced in such a way that the journey to get there feels natural. With the obvious exception being the often hated Water Temple, at no point does the game feel as though it's hitting the player with a difficulty spike or a wall that can't be overcome. And a lot of that progression is tied to just how well Ocarina of Time handled its use of items and abilities. Every single item in this game serves to keep the overall experience as fresh as possible and is the key ingredient for why each of the dungeons works so well and feels so inherently satisfying to navigate. Even some of the more lesser utilized items serve a purpose for the player. Let's go back to the previously mentioned Water Temple. For most players, one of the reasons why this area of the game is so frustrating is due to the gimmick of changing the water level that's locked behind 3 different sections of the dungeon. And while this backtracking between 3 areas can be frustrating and time-consuming, the use of the optional spell Faror's Wind can make traversing them a little less tedious. It's this versatility in how the player is able to take shortcuts using their new items and abilities that really solidify that style of progression into 3D Zelda's DNA. Unlike many of its successors, Ocarina of Time's central gimmick doesn't really halt its pacing, and instead acts as a clear-cut linear progression that feels natural. Because of this, Ocarina is always able to introduce new locations and gameplay segments without worrying about incorporating any set of rules or strict structure. The player is constantly introduced to new areas or unique spins upon revisiting areas. From the moment Link leaves Kokiri Forest, the player is introduced to a wide open world, with the only task being to reach Hyrule Castle. And while Hyrule Field pales in comparison to some other games in the series, in terms of secrets to uncover and overall content, it also acts as a perfect break in between the game's many locations. By the time the player reaches Hyrule Castle Town, there's so many things thrown in at once, it perfectly encapsulates the high-energy, bustling nature of the town. From shops to minigame areas to NPCs, the Castletown Market is a great parallel to Kokiri Forest in terms of design and how it feels almost suffocating to a child Link in comparison to the more relaxed nature of the game's starting area. Eventually, the player is tasked with sneaking past the guards in a stealth-like segment before meeting Princess Zelda and triggering the cutscene that puts the story into more focus. It's after this encounter with Zelda where the main gameplay loop for Ocarina of Time begins. Travel to Goron Village, collect the Goron Ruby, head to Zora's Domain, collect the Zora Sapphire, and return all 3 spiritual stones to Zelda, bringing an end to the child section of the game. However, after the 7-year time skip, the game amps up in difficulty and the player is tasked with returning to many of the locations first explored in the child era. The newly monster-infested Kokiri Forest, the endlessly erupting Death Mountain, the now frozen tomb of what used to be Zora's Domain, and the Shadow Temple, found hidden in the graveyard of Kakariko Village. These visual and tonal changes from the child era to the adult era help make revisiting each of these locations feel fresh and new. You can't help but to compare them, and yet, it adds so much to make these locations feel real. You want to save these places because you've already seen how beautiful they can be. It acts as not only a way to distinguish each area, but as a driving force for the player to want to subconsciously undo what Ganon has done, and see each part of Hyrule restored to its former glory. By the time the player finishes up the Shadow Temple, Hyrule has a strong sense of familiarity. You've seen every major location and have probably revisited most of them in a new light multiple times over the course of the game. Major landmarks such as Lake Hylia and the windmill in Kakariko Village become an afterthought after hours of playtime and exploring. But then, something amazing happens. Gerudo Valley is, in my opinion, one of the greatest sections in Ocarina of Time. Serving as the game's final act until the climax, this area completely reinforces just how incredible Ocarina is at introducing new concepts and improving upon previously established ones. Aside from the unique visual aesthetic of the rugged, sun-drenched desert, this entire area of the game provides so much in terms of variety and content without any of its gimmicks slowing down the pacing. Gerudo Valley is by far the most ambitious of any of the previous pre-dungeon segments. The tension of sneaking through the heavily guarded Gerudo Fortress, followed by the intense trek through the challenges of the Haunted Wasteland, are some of the most memorable and iconic. All this eventually leading to the visual spectacle that is the Spirit Temple. While every other dungeon in the adult era has Link revisiting new spins on areas seen as a child, the Spirit Temple flips this concept on its head and does the reverse. In order to complete the first section of the dungeon, Link has to go back in time and face it as a child. This gimmick goes well beyond just being symbolic. It acts as a clever way to scale up the difficulty in the most natural way possible. After spending hours with the upgraded Master Sword and the versatility of adult Link, having to go back to Child Link is the perfect handicap for the player as they go up against puzzles and enemies that now feel far more powerful than they ever did before. And speaking of enemies, the entire desert portion of the game introduces us to some of the best enemy encounters Ocarina has to offer. For as highly praised as Ocarina of Time is, one of the most common criticisms with the game seems to be with its seemingly simplistic combat. Now, I'm not here to convince you that the combat in this game is some unrecognized masterpiece or anything, and in terms of the broader scope of the series, it is on the simplistic side of things. However, I truly do believe that these combat encounters serve their purpose in creating tense and sometimes challenging gameplay segments, and Gerudo Desert provides some of the greatest examples of that. The fast, agile encounters with the Gerudo captains demonstrate just how important spatial awareness is within Ocarina of Time's combat. From the moment they appear, you have to constantly pay attention to their animations and assess whether or not it's safe to go in for a couple of close slashes. What makes these fights even more intense is that no matter how many hearts the player has by this portion of the game, each of the Gerudo captains has an instant kill move that will send Link back to the jail cell, forcing him to start the stealth section over again. This attack can always be avoided as long as the player picks up on the captain's wind-up animation and creates enough distance in order to not get hit. During the Spirit Temple, we're also introduced to my all-time favorite enemy type in the game, the Iron Knuckle. Even from just a visual standpoint, these giant axe-wielding knights look insanely menacing, and the fights against them are just as heart-pounding. Unlike majority of all the other enemies found in the game, the Iron Knuckles don't have clear indications on when to attack or evade. There is no weak spot or right time to attack. It all comes down to quick reflexes and careful decision-making based on their axe swing animations. It's up to the player to judge whether or not to go for a few quick strikes or risk a jump slash for more damage. Even with the maximum amount of health, a few slip-ups can lead to death against these enemies. Gerudo Valley and the Spirit Temple act as the ultimate final major areas to explore and navigate in Hyrule. Everything about this portion of the game exists to keep things fresh and offers some of the greatest puzzles and gameplay segments in an experience that already felt so well polished and satisfying. Looking back on everything the player's done up until this point, I think it's safe to say that one of the reasons Ocarina of Time is so consistent is that none of these areas overstay their welcome. They exist to introduce or put a spin on previously established gameplay elements, and then send the player off on a new task before those elements become stale or boring. Even the final dungeon of the game does such a great job showing off this in a bite-sized form. The first area of Ganon's castle tasks Link with dispelling 6 barriers that block access to the central tower. Each of these 6 barriers act as a sort of mini-dungeon, based on all the previous prior dungeons, as well as an original section for the light barrier. This serves as a perfect finale to Ocarina of Time and really evokes the feeling of a true climax. Utilizing and revisiting many of the items and puzzles throughout the game, and even blending some together to create new challenges feels satisfying. It acts as a sort of comparison and reflection on just how much the player's accomplished over the course of this journey. Choosing to not drag out any one area of the game for too long is the secret to Ocarina of Time's consistent flow. It allows every major section of the game to be looked at fondly and creates a very satisfying gameplay experience. And despite many of the areas being places that the player revisits constantly, the new visual and gameplay twists make them stand out to the point where almost nobody considers areas like the Great Deku Tree and the Forest Temple to be similar. All of these factors culminate into one of the most consistent and enjoyable video games to ever be released. And if this consistency in game design is to be seen as the skeleton that holds Ocarina of Time up, then its story, characters, and music are the soul that further enhance its overall legacy. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time is a surprisingly cinematic game. For a narrative that contains no voice-acted dialogue, the story remains one of the most well-remembered due to the superb character design and direction of its many cutscenes. At its core, Ocarina of Time is a coming-of-age story, and one that shows just how impactful the flow of time can be and how it shapes the view of the world and the responsibility that comes with adulthood. It's a story that can be relatable to almost anybody that plays it due to the broad scope of Link's journey. Despite not having an actual speaking voice to convey his emotions, Link is able to express so much through the use of subtle details in the game. The tossing and turning during the restless nightmares, or the look of genuine shock on his face, do such a great job showing us the type of person Link is at the start of the adventure. A young, shy kid with no knowledge of the outside world, cast aside by his peers, yet longing for adventure deep in his heart. Ocarina gives us the most detailed representation of any hero seen at this point in the series, and the surrounding characters do such an amazing job at enhancing that as well. Characters such as the strong and muscular Darunia or the smug-looking Princess Ruto ooze personality, and the way that they're portrayed in the story through the use of upbeat dance sequences or even gameplay mechanics show that there's so much more to them than meets the eye. Of course, we couldn't discuss character design and narrative importance without talking about Ganon. Serving as the game's main antagonist, Ganondorf is one of the best examples of just how cinematic Ocarina of Time is. His visual design, presence, and deep low-pitched grunts act as the perfect contrast to everything Link is not. In a story about growing up and how childish dreams can give way to true responsibility, Ganon exists as a representation of the darker side of that ideology. The game refers to him as the King of Thieves, and always shows visuals of darkness and fire when referencing him. Raised in a brutal desert wasteland, Ganondorf was born as a king, a ruler with endless resources at his disposal. This contrasting heavily with Link, a child born not as a king, but as an outsider. No purpose and nowhere to belong. This duality between Ganon and Link sets the stage for the overall narrative and helps make Ganondorf an effective villain. His absence through most of the child portion of the game, all culminating to the scene after opening the Door of Time. The naive nature of young Zelda and Link being exploited by the cunning and manipulative adult Ganon acts as the perfect segue into the next arc of the game. Many of the cutscenes that define the adult arc of the game are those that contain Ocarina of Time's greatest supporting character, Sheik. These moments between Link and Sheik add an extra layer of maturity and mystery not present in the child section of the game. These scenes feel almost poetic with their use of dialogue and focus on musical pieces, and the duets between the two characters also highlight one of Ocarina's greatest strengths, its masterful OST. While many of Ocarina's more memorable songs have become iconic due to their use in future installments of the series, even some of the more forgotten about tracks go a long way in adding atmosphere to the environments of Hyrule. From the Minuet of Forest to the Requiem of Spirit, each song evokes the feeling of Hyrule's locations almost better than any visual element could ever hope to. While each of these songs could easily stand on their own, when paired with the game's striking cutscenes, they become a perfect combination of visual and audio storytelling. While the character designs and music are widely praised by most, one of the aspects of Ocarina of Time that I find goes overlooked is its cinematography. The use of dynamic camera angles and dramatic close-ups adds so much into the overall immersion of the game. Switching perspectives to suit the scene and draw players' focus to specific details goes a long way in terms of making a scene feel memorable. One of my all-time favorite examples of this comes late into the game, right after the water temple. Upon returning to Kakariko Village, the game cuts to scenes of smoke and fire engulfing the town as it slowly pans over to Sheik, standing alone in front of the well. In one continuous shot, Link runs over as Sheik yells to get back. Pay attention to how well the camera is used to create tension against this faceless, unseen enemy. The alternating close-ups and environmental shots keep the scene chaotic and intense without ever taking the viewer's attention off of the danger. Even going so far as to switch to the perspective of the threat itself, much like a classic horror film. By the time the scene ends and Link wakes up from his attack, the tone is set, and the seeds of fear in the yet-to-come bottom of the well and Shadow Temple have already been planted. And then comes the finale. At the end of this long journey, after all three holders of the Triforce are gathered, and after a last-minute escape through the collapsing ruins of Ganon's tower, the final showdown awaits. As Link and Zelda breathe a sigh of relief, a sound echoes from the rubble. And as Link approaches, the essence of Ganon explodes out of the mass of stone and the stage is set for one of the greatest cinematic final battles of all time. Not only is this final battle the conclusion to Link's story, but it acts as the origin of the mythos of Ganon as well, showing the cycle come full circle and presenting the player with the first look at the classic villain of the series. The reason why this fight works so well as a climax to the narrative is that both Link and Ganondorf are no longer the same as the characters we met at the start of the game. Both of them have sacrificed a part of who they are in order to take down the other in a final clash of courage versus power. Link, having given up so much of his childhood and innocence in order to become the hero of time, and Ganon, having sacrificed his humanity and physical body to allow the Triforce of Power to fully consume him. Both characters are going all out in one last attempt to thwart the other. The atmosphere during this fight is nothing short of masterful. The dark clouds contrasting with the ring of flames that make up the arena, as well as the menacing figure of Ganon's body shrouded in darkness, make for a visual treat. The way his body is mostly hidden in darkness, only to be visible during the periodic strikes of lightning, is one of the most striking uses of lighting in the entire game, and they save it for just the right moment. With Ganon down, Link takes the Master Sword and in one final blow, strikes the blade deep into the skull of the beast, signifying an end to the game, as well as the conclusion to his narrative arc. Zelda once again calls upon each of the sages met throughout the game as they come together to seal Ganon for good. Each of them representing a different part of Link's journey through adulthood. Friendship, brotherhood, love, loyalty, romance, and with Zelda's intervention, destiny. Having given up so much, Link's journey finally culminates into one single blow. However, as Ganon is sealed away, he vows that one day he will exterminate the descendants of Link and Zelda. This final message goes perfectly with the theme of the cruelness of time, showing that, just like how Link eventually grew strong enough to stop Ganon, one day, Ganon will grow strong and rise again. Nothing is free from the flow of time. That light and darkness are always on a cycle that moves like the hands on a clock. As the world is saved and the people of Hyrule celebrate, the game shows off its bittersweet conclusion. In an attempt to give back the years stolen from him, Zelda sends Link to his own time to live the rest of his life free from responsibility in a world that will no longer know of his heroic actions, while Zelda and the sages remain in their time in order to rebuild Hyrule and undo the 7 years of Ganon's destruction. For both Link and Zelda, time moves on, each with their own unique challenges and advantages. The world always moves forward into tomorrow, and the impact of self-sacrifice is a theme that makes the ending of this game feel so amazing and satisfying. From the nightmares of a young child to the banishing of an ultimate evil, Ocarina of Time takes us on a journey across an amazing land and introduces us to some of the most fantastic characters that stick in our minds long after the credits roll. They exist as the soul that gives life to an already well-crafted work of video game genius, and the combination of fundamental consistency mixed with a timeless, memorable narrative creates an experience that stands out as an example of what to strive for. One of Ocarina's main themes is that the flow of time is always cruel, and that things that are once lost in its flow can never return. The irony of this is that, as the years go by, Ocarina stands unaffected by the passage of time, and instead, much like the Master Sword, acts as a gateway for many of its players. A gateway that connects the stressful and sometimes bleak world of responsibility to an era of childlike wonder long forgotten. It's due to this ability to defy the odds and maintain its magic in the hearts of so many players that I can say with the utmost certainty that The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time is, and always will be, a masterpiece.